Grief isn't the end of your story, it's the beginning of a new chapter. Welcome back to another episode of the Empowered Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamoni, the founder of the Empowered Grief Journey coaching and podcast platform. Each episode brings real conversations with people from around the world who have navigated profound loss and found the strength to rebuild their lives with courage and intention. Together, we'll explore what it means to move from survival to integration, reclaim your identity, honor your grief journey, and create a future grounded in resilience and purpose. Walk with us as we transform grief into growth, one story at a time. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to invite you listeners to head over to empoweredgriefjourney.com where you can explore recent episodes of the podcast, grab your copy of the Empowered Grief Journey anthology, and book a free grief clarity call to start your own empowered grief journey. Today, I have a special guest with us. His name is Frank. He's a retired chiropractor, a published author, facilitator, and speaker empowering individuals and organizations as he advocates for emotional wellness. He shares his journey through presentations and workshops, inspiring others to awaken their inner strength and live their lives in harmony, purpose, and peace. He is the creator of the four pillars of emotional prosperity, blending the ancient wisdom of yin and yang with principles of physical, mental, spiritual, and material well being as transformative tools to move forward from the emotional lack mentality surrounding grief and trauma. And so, without further ado, Frank, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
Likewise, I'm really glad we get to connect today. And you have a great story around your own grief journey and what led you to be able to create the four pillars of emotional prosperity, which I'm looking forward to diving into a bit in this podcast. Could you start off by sharing with listeners today a little bit more about yourself and your grief journey that you went through?
Certainly, the the beginnings started in 2000 when my wife was diagnosed originally with breast cancer. She battled that for 4 years, and in the process, we both journaled. She did it easily. I had a difficult time with it. Couldn't get started. Took me a couple of weeks, and then she just looked at me and said, "Francesco, you're an artist. Sketch." So I did. I started to draw in my journal that she had given to me, and eventually words started to work their way out and end up in the margins next to stick figures that were crooked with big heads and, you know, looking like a 3-year-old's drawings, which kind of funny is I was using crayons that my daughter, I still had, those giant monstrous Crayola crayons that 3 years old she would grip them in her fist to do her drawing, and I was using the same ones, but it was helpful. It started the process.
That's a beautiful start to your story. And then I remember in our pre-interview, you were talking about still having those crayons from years and years ago.
Yes, and it's still in the drawer. Still in the drawer. You just, it's not that you become a hoarder. You become particular about what it is that holds value in your life. And things like the crayons hold value for me because it's a remembrance of a journey I had with my children when they were young before I divorced their mom. And I kept all of her drawings. And when she graduated from Cleveland Institute of Art, I had all of them framed and I gave them to her as a graduation present. And she was like totally blown away. So was I. I mean, just going through the process and then putting them in a frame and wrapping them, my eyes just naturally emptied, you know. But it's that type of memory that becomes very important for someone like myself who has lost a wife to an insidious disease such as breast cancer. Because those memories, when you utilize them in a format that is happy, it's uplifting. you're not functioning on a memory of what could have been from the end result, but what you had through the process. And that kind of brings a humility to your heart-centered self that supports you and eventually comes out into how you interact with others.
You know, Frank, I've been looking forward to this podcast with you because I don't often get to talk to many men who go through grief or go through loss for that matter. And, something you and I share in common, we've walked a cancer journey together with those in our lives, and we've seen that cancer is a very ugly, cruel disease that is very, very hard when it becomes an end-of-life situation. It becomes very, very hard to process everything that's going on in that moment, let alone trying to figure out how we feel about things. And I know for us men, we're kind of brought up in society to be the tough ones and not show vulnerability or show what we're really feeling inside. And I really appreciated in our pre-interview how open you were with that to share that side of compassion and that side of vulnerability through this, and to show that, it's okay for us men not to always be tough and put on a strong face all the time.
That's how we were trained. I mean, we were brought up to become the patriarchs of our family, to be stoic and not show emotion, have answers, and to be there for others. And that's all part of it. It's growing up in that type of an environment. And you embrace it, you recognize it, you know that you're doing it, and then when you're involved in a situation such as ours, and with breast cancer or any cancer, it doesn't hold water anymore. It has no, you have no foothold. It's like your toolbox just got emptied, and you're looking for something that just doesn't exist. Um, it leaves you in a very awkward place because you're essentially lost.
Yeah, I feel like, when men do go through situations like that, such as losing a spouse to breast cancer, like you said about the toolbox being emptied out, when all we've been shown is how to be stoic and how to have all the answers, lead the family, be the strong one all the time. And when we do eventually face a situation like that, it almost feels in many ways like we're unprepared in a lot of ways to handle that situation. We're also put in a place where we're trying to figure out that our identity that we've been so attached to growing up and shown in that stoic fashion all of a sudden starts to shift and change in ways that we're not prepared for.
I totally agree, and it left me in the gutter, emotionally, um, and it progressed. It just got worse over time. She passed away in 2004, and the depth of emotional disquiet, I call it, introducing depression into my life and in ways that I had no concept or ability to embrace. I couldn't find an answer or connectivity to my emotions because they were just so scattered. And that progressed and it got worse over time. And what I realized was that there were buttons that were getting, for lack of better words, I have a better word, but triggers and buttons are the typical ones that we are accustomed to hearing or associating with some type of an emotional component that has taken your nervous system to a different level, so that you are emotionally unprepared. You are reacting to situations rather than considering any type of response, because a response requires a pause, and a pause is a reflection of forethought. And none of those are in our vocabulary because we just go. We just, it happens, it comes to us, and then we, whether it's vocal, whether it's physical, it's primordial. It's, something that's been in our genes from the time we were hunter-gatherers and beyond or before. So it's something that we have that functions for us in our brains to protect us. But when it doesn't, you're vulnerable. And that vulnerability comes out in ways that you don't like because you haven't got any answers, you haven't got any tools, you haven't got anything to put back in that toolbox, that's going to have any value to you. And those are things that took time for me because all my tools came at different periods of time during the 15 years after Judith passed away. A little bit here and a little bit there. Journaling was the initial one. Acknowledgement came about 8 years later with peer group counseling and realizing that there were childhood traumas that I had experienced that had set the stage for my reactive behaviors growing up. And we all have them. That was the hardest thing to recognize in myself because I kind of thought that they were just mine. You take ownership of them in a way that you want to protect them because they're yours, you know, but they're negative. You know,
Yeah, they're a part of our journey and a part of who we are, and they do shape, in many ways who we become at a certain point in our life. But it's not to say that these experiences of grief and loss can identify ourselves in the moment. When we go through grief and loss, I was reading a book recently, and a guy described grief as a very personal experience that's going to affect all of us very differently depending on the quality of that relationship and the value we put into that. And that's where I think that when we lose a spouse or we lose a pet or we lose something very valuable and important in our life, and all of a sudden, like us as men, our skill set of stoicism kind of falls to the wayside, and now we are forced in this place to be very present with a loss situation in a very different way with emotion and vulnerability, things we weren't taught very well. It becomes a very uncertain ground and in a place of where we lost something very important, but it's also a very new place. It's a very uncertain, unfamiliar, area of saying, how am I going to navigate this? How am I going to, how do I process how I feel about this? And I think many of us, like you said, and I love that you said this, it takes time. It can take 8 years to find some of those answers.
and I was just getting halfway through them. I mean, I ended up with five: journaling, acknowledgement, surrender, laughter, and meditative prayer. And those five components became my new tools that I put in my toolbox. Now, whether those tools are beneficial for anyone else, of course, like you said, everyone is different. But that doesn't mean that in our differences that you wouldn't recognize what tools could be beneficial for you to put in your toolbox just from my examples. So it's like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. You have that moment where, he's saying the same thing. I felt just like he did, but my tools are different. And that's an important point. That's an important transition for someone to recognize that their individuality has purpose and has presence. And that is a deciding factor as to the types of tools that they will embrace to put in their own toolbox. It's not like going down to Lowe's or Home Depot. These tools aren't found there. They're just not something you can pick up. Is You
I,
have to create them.
well, I think in many ways, those tools are found through conversations like you and I are having today. And Something I found very empowering about the podcast I run is that I've oftentimes had so many people thank me for everything I give them on here. You guys, as guests, have given me a lot of tools and a lot of purpose and a lot of meaning because something I've come to find is that even though grief is a very personal experience and we all navigate it very differently, there are commonalities between it. And sometimes we run into somebody, such as yourself today. You and I might say the same thing, but it's going to be different words and different language and different process, different way to get there. And I think that, coming back to what you said about the individuality of these tools, is that when we allow ourselves to have these conversations and allow ourselves to be open-minded to talking to somebody else who's walked through a grief journey and seeing it from their perspective, how they navigated it, we might often hear that thing we know, but it's going to come in a different light. And that's where I think the breakthrough shift happens that can set us on a path to healing.
You're absolutely right, Chris. It is. It's those small little moments of not necessarily considered to be an aha moment, but like, Maxwell's silver hammer in the Beatles tapping you in the backside of your head going, and you go, wow, why didn't I think of that? That's a good idea. So you kind of cross boundaries that are cross oceans that I mean, I'm a sailor, so anything to do with water is I'm all over it. But the ocean of dealing with grief was a difficult journey for me. And
What,
uh,
something I wanted to ask you about, because I know a lot of men struggle with this, and I get asked it often when I'm coaching people and running into conversations like we're having today. What was it like for you in your grief journey where there's kind of a point that you hit where you kind of shift from grief into healing, and it's sometimes very subtle and very quiet. Sometimes it happens over a span of time. Sometimes there's a moment that triggers it. I wanted to ask you, what was that like for you when you reached that point in your grief journey where you were able to go, because I've been in that place where you're very depressed and it seems like life is just really not going where you want it to go. And then all of a sudden something shifts. And that shift moment is oftentimes where we begin the healing journey.
Mine came at a peer group counseling session. I'm in a room with 15 other people. We're all sitting in a circle, and it took me 2 or 3 weeks before I even opened my mouth. I just sat there and just listened to other people tell their stories. And what impacted me the most was the trembling of their voice at the beginning, and then the subtlety of change into calm as they progress in their story. It's like once they vocalized it, it put it out there, releasing it to a certain extent so that it became a tangible element that you could reshape like a potter with the clay on the wheel. You have a chance to change it, shift it, mold it into something that has value. And that's what they were doing in reality, just in their presence and being there. When I finally opened my mouth, Chris, I was shocked as to what came out. But when I left that room that evening, it wasn't that I felt lighter. I felt as though I had the opportunity to put something down that I had been carrying for so long and didn't realize it
Tell me
until
more about that.
you know. So it was part of the grief, and at the same time, it was part of the childhood memories of going to a Catholic elementary school and being abused to the point where your self-esteem becomes challenged. You learn to be quiet. It's like, children are seen and not heard. from our parents. So that there's one element. You go through that. Don't do this, don't do that. They all have purpose in molding us as children and molding us in how we will adapt as adults. But it's the stronger ones, it's the ones that really impact you, like getting whacked over the knuckles with a wooden yardstick, or having your hair greased down because you had four cowlicks. You had things that sticked up in your head, and the nun didn't like it. So she took Vaseline and greased my head down. And of course, you get the finger pointing from all your classmates, and that in itself is degrading. And so you go through that type of environment. It really, I'm left-handed, and that was the reason. Not only because I was a troublemaker, I was always joking around, but because I was left-handed was the most dramatic affront to the nun. She would take the pencil out of my left hand and put it in my right hand. And I would attempt to write right-handed, and then I would just give up. And I'd put it back in my left hand, and invariably, here comes the yardstick. Bang! Well, to this day, I am left-handed. I
Well,
can proudly
Frank,
say that I overcame, all the purple coloration of my knuckles and being whacked and told to go sit in a corner, and but those are all elements of learned behavior, negative learned behavior that mold us into who we are, and it carries through our adult life. And that's what was happening. I had put that stuff into deep storage. I hadn't even considered the impact of that information. And yet, in this group environment, I was hearing similar stories from other people in the group, and it was starting to pull the deep storage. The closet doors were opening up, and information was coming forward, and I'm going, holy crap, holy crap. I had no idea that I had been carrying this through my adult life, and it was impacting how I practiced, how I responded to other people, my desires to what? Give answers, to be functional, to provide care as a caregiver. So you give, 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 and you don't expect anything in return. But in reality, it's a two-way street. If you don't get anything back, you don't have anything to give. You tapped out. And essentially that was where burnout in my practice occurred. And I learned another tool from that was surrendering, and put that in my toolbox. The first three actually are coping skills, improvements that you can take. Journaling, acknowledging the particular situation, and surrendering to a single friend, not a group of friends, just one individual or a counselor or a coach, someone you can open to and feel honest with, and that will just sit there and listen and not give any advice. And that's the biggest issue that we have in many conversations with people we may call friends, is that they're so willing to give you advice. And advice is only about the future. It's not about the present, not about where you are. So,
Frank, you brought up a good point about surrender. And I think that's a big part of grief that a lot of us don't realize is going to take a lot of time to get to. And there's plenty of people out there that are willing to give advice. They're willing to fix us, try to fix us, tell us what to do or how to do it or how we should grieve. And Something I've come along the lines in my own journey of speaking to everybody in my own personal experience. Grievers will figure that out on their own. They don't need to be told how to be fixed. They will get there on their own. So there's no shortage of those things. But what is the surrender piece. And I love that you said finding one person, not a group of people, but one person you can surrender with, because grief does reach a point, I think, like a breaking point, so to speak, of where we get to surrender. And I usually call it acceptance in my world of things, because I have found that those emotions will reach a point where you've gotten all that frustration, the sadness, the hurt, the anger, it all just is, it's all exhausted itself to a breaking point. And that breaking point oftentimes is the surrender. And it's where we come to find ourselves in a place of, I may not like this or agree to it, but I accept myself permission to say that I've allowed myself to feel all these things. Now it's time for me to figure out what is that next step forward for me? How do I take that one small step forward for myself in the future?
Yeah, and you don't like yours took a certain amount of time. Mine seemed like forever, but eventually got there. Um, and it precipitated moving in a direction of research about words and the impact they have on us as individuals, positive language, history of language. Uh, and it became the format for this current book, um, providing an opportunity to give the reader choices, getting them to think about where they are, think about where they are physically, mentally, spiritually, materially. Materially, I mean, this is probably the next question that you were going to ask me about, but we're heading that direction. We might as well jump the fence. So, um, the, as a chiropractic physician, my whole premise behind my practice was my training and education, the physical or the mental, body, mind, spirit concept. And then I shifted it. And instead of saying body, I said physical. And instead of saying mind, I said mental. And spirit became spiritual. But then I added an element. I added material. Because when we think in terms of prosperity, that's where we go. We look at the dollar sign, we look at our productivity, how we react and respond in an environment of accumulation. And emotional prosperity is has nothing to do with accumulation. It recognizes it, it understands its purpose, but in the same time, you have to realize that the material aspect is connected to how you physically feel, how emotions respond to in your body, how they are expressed before they even hit the mental. The physical changes are there prior to any type of intellectual vocabulary to define it. You're already there.
Yeah. Frank, I love what you just said about that because I didn't believe this many years ago, but a lot of people think physical ailment is solely physical. And I will share with listeners, this one's a real eye-opener if you get to a place like Frank was just talking about with processing your emotions and understanding and feeling them. Sometimes our emotions manifest as physical pain in our body. Somehow they end up in certain places, and maybe that's lower back pain, maybe that's a shoulder pain or a knee that just doesn't want to function right. But I learned through some of my grief journeys I've been through, and I started realizing those physical pains were there and started digging in the emotions of things. What's the pain? What pain am I going through emotionally, not just physically? I found the correlation between the two, and I'm really curious, Frank. What are your thoughts on that?
Um, well, there's documented uh, science related to how our bodies express our emotions prior to. We use the language, let's say, in the physical body, metaphors. I have a weight on my chest. My tummy is a boiling cauldron. These metaphors are expressions that reflect what is going to happen up here.
Mm.
That's part of your fight or flight, your what I don't want to get too over the edge vocabulary wise, but there's a portion of your brain that has a great deal to do with how you react to situations or conditions in your environment. And those are what we learn. Those are what gets stored. Those are what become memory. And it's the similarity of many instances in the environment that reflect those memories that trigger the buttons and the reaction to a situation that may not even be correlated to the original situation. Oh, you can have a car accident. You were a passenger. You're sitting in a car and you were in a car accident. But now, 15 years later, you get into a car with a friend who happened to be in the same vehicle with you in that same car accident. Where do you want to sit?
You, I don't think you'd want to be in the passenger seat.
Well, it wouldn't matter. You certainly wouldn't want to be in the passenger seat, but you would certainly want to be in a situation in that vehicle where you felt more comfortable.
Mm, gotcha. So
Okay.
you, yeah.
Because it's that correlation, it's that old memory that is causing your heart to beat faster, maybe even go into a perspiratory sweat because you remembered of a situation that you didn't like and you got hurt and you don't want to be hurt again. And that metaphor can be used across the board. And you can pick whatever injury that you sustained, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, right on down the line, it's going to cause a physical production of something before you become emotionally attached to it.
Uh,
And that,
I love how you're correlating our past experiences of life into the present moment. Because I think that's something that it's becoming new age, so to speak. We're just now acknowledging it and trying to understand it, but it's something that's always been a part of our human nature. And I think that the example you gave, by the way, of being in a Catholic school and having a nun, hit your hand with rulers. I'm a lefty too, by the way. Just wanted to put that out there. Um, so I certainly I can empathize deeply with that because us lefties, it's just we're wired that way, just how it is. But that memory and that experience we had stays embedded in us, and there's a future. When we move forward into the future, there's situations we face where they're similar in some way, shape, or form to what we experienced in the past, and our brain has the capacity to connect the dots. But sometimes we have to know in our future self as we get older, as we grow, as we learn, as we evolve, that those two situations actually aren't the same situation, but this one in the past was there to teach us something. And if we learn from it, and even if we get triggered by it in the moment with something in the future, we always can give ourselves that space to respond, like you were talking about at the start of the podcast. Response requires a pause. It requires us to stop for a second and ask a question or dig a little deeper into what we're feeling or experiencing or emoting at that point.
Yeah, that's our physical aspect. And then the mental is the stories we tell ourselves, the self-talk.
Mm.
And that's where the low self-esteem, the I can't come in, I don't deserve comes in. You reach a point where if you're attempting to be functional in, say, a job or with your family or whatever the situation might be, there's going to come a time when those words are going to come out of your mouth. And it's self-judgment. I should have. Why didn't I? I could have. And those are all elements that we do to ourselves, but we do them because of what we learned. It's what we stored up. It's what we have in our minds as memory, as to even though we are now adults, we're still being affected by the negativity of the learned behavior that accumulated over time from when we were a kid. There's a neuroscientist by the name of Bruce Lipton, and he theorized that children are in what he called an absorption phase from the time of birth until the age of reason, which would be considered 7 years old. In that 7 year period, every don't do that, every element of, you know, how can I say this? Every element of behavioral control makes us who we are. And I agree with him, but I disagree with him
Mm.
because I believe that all of that he's talking about in that first 7 years starts at the time of inception.
Mm.
Now, once that morula and that blastula begins to divide and becomes viable, you are being nourished by the blood of your mother. That's chemistry. If you're upset or you're depressed or you're anxious, it changes your chemistry. It impacting how your blood is being processed and pumped through your body. And where's it? It's going right through the placenta. It's going right into this developing little fetus. Then once it reaches a point in time where sound becomes a viable option, now it's not just chemistry. Now it's audible. So every argument that gets created in the environment of that household, every happy moment that's shared in that household is having an impact. There, that fetus is already being programmed prior to Bruce Lipton's developmental absorption period after birth. That's my perception. That's how I think from being a chiropractic physician and understanding the importance of development from the period of time of inception to birth, because that in itself, that miracle is beyond explanation. It's not something that it's scientifically understood to a certain degree, but I think is missed misrepresented in its total importance, even
Well,
spiritually. So,
well,
but
Frank, I just want to say I've really enjoyed the conversation
we're
today.
there
Number
already.
one. Yeah, we're there. I just
Uh,
want to say this has been a really great conversation about grief and about all the different aspects within ourselves, including our past traumas, by the way, that do influence and play a role in how we take and perceive grief as we go through life. I'm a big believer, as you described today, that there's many childhood experiences we have that we just don't think about all the time when we're adults, when we're 30, 40, 50 years old and go through a grief situation or lose a spouse or lose a pet, things like that. We just don't always think back to how's my body reacting right now? How's my brain reacting? What's this learned behavior that I have inside me that's running subconsciously? It's not even conscious, it's running in the background guiding me down this path. And I'm not realizing, by the way, that I have a choice. I can make a different choice. I can choose how I want to handle my grief. I can choose how I want to respond in the future. You brought up such a powerful dialogue today on how to navigate grief, and I'm very very grateful you and I had the chance to connect, my friend.
so let's do it again.
Yeah, let's. I'd love to have you back for another episode. I think we could go deeper. So I'm excited about that. Um,
Yeah,
So, Frank, as we wrap up the podcast, I usually like to ask my guests at the end of the show, if listeners enjoyed this episode today and they want to connect with you, do you have a website, social media? Where can they find you?
they can find me at my website, www.emotionalprosperitynetwork.com. Uh, email wise, frank.emotionalprosperity@gmail.com. And they'll see the new book. In fact, it just went to the publisher today for formatting, so it'll be out probably in 2 months. Um, and that covers the four pillars, the relationships to emotional prosperity, and the correlation to emotional intelligence, because they're similar, but they're different. You know, emotional intelligence is awareness and regulation and integration. And there's another one in there somewhere. There's four of them. But physical, mental, spiritual, and material are mine. And they correlate so well with emotional prosperity. So, um, yeah, jump onto the website and learn some more. And I look forward to having another conversation with you sometime in the future, Chris.
Well, thank you, Frank. I do as well. And for listeners today, I want you guys to know that Frank's email and his website will be in the show notes. When you guys get done listening to this episode, jump down there, reach out and connect with Frank. As you guys have seen today, very phenomenal guy, very, very knowledgeable. And by the way, he shared a set of tools that I think are very relevant, very open-ended for grief. I love that you can take the tools that he provides and really give yourself a new choice and a new option as you navigate your grief journey. So I want to invite you guys to check out his website, reach out to him. Frank, I'm looking forward to another conversation, but I just want to say as we wrap up, thank you again for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for inviting me, and blessings in health and abundance and emotional prosperity to you and your listening audience.
Well, I want to thank all of you guys for joining Frank and I on today's episode of the Empowered Grief Journey podcast. If this episode resonates with you, please share it with somebody you know who may need to hear this conversation today. And if you've been feeling stuck or overwhelmed or unsure of how to move forward in your grief, just know you don't have to figure it out alone. I offer free grief clarity calls where we can talk through what you're experiencing, help you understand what's going on beneath the surface, and find a clear path forward. You guys can book your call over at empoweredgriefjourney.com. You can also explore past episodes there and subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Podbean so you never miss a conversation like this. The Empower Grief Journey is all about honoring your experience, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. I want you to know you're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.